And so what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce Todd, and then I think David will make an announcement about
I'll make it at the end.
Okay, at the end. So this is Todd Cleveland, as you probably know already. He's an assistant professor of history at Augustana College near Chicago. And I know Todd because we went to graduate school together in Minnesota. We were both working with Alan Isaacman, who many of you probably know Alan's work. He's a very interesting character. Fantastic person to work with. And Todd's work has focused, as long as I've known him, his work has focused on the experiences of forced African labor in the diamond mines in Colonial Angola. I think that's sort of the big project he's working on. He'll be presenting on that tomorrow. And that project has brought him both to Luanda and to Portugal in the archives, as well as to the historic diamond-bearing district of Lunda Norte in Angola. And he has a book coming out on this project. And then he has another project, a current project, and that is this project on the migration of African soccer players from Portugal's colonies at the time to the metropole, and that's what he'll be talking about today. So on that, I'll turn this over to Todd.
Great. Thank you, Libby. Thank everyone who's had a hand in bringing me here. I warn you that this is research in progress, so that's my disclaimer, and I could use any and all feedback as I move through this. As Libby indicated, the primary sort of thrust of my research has been, and sort of continues to be, the history of diamond mining in colonial Angola, and so I'm only able to kind of visit and revisit this research, for a month or two every summer, and so unfortunately I have to put it back on the shelf for stretches. But I'm hoping I should have a chapter coming out in an edited volume this summer, and then I'm hoping when the diamond research culminates, that actually the research is done, it's just a matter of finishing up the book, then I can turn my attention more full-time to this, my true passion, soccer. Not as diamonds are interesting and wonderful, but they're not soccer, or football, or futsal. Anyways, so that's my disclaimer. This is, as I was explaining to Libby, the project's a bit perhaps schizophrenic in nature right now. It's sort of part labor history, part social history, part migration history, part sports history. So it's a lot of things. Hopefully it's something and not nothing. But it's a lot of sort of, I'm sort of engaging with a lot of sort of individual bodies of literature that may not necessarily come through in this talk. This will just be more content. But I think it has a lot of potential, but it's still sort of in an incipient phase. So with that said, this is the photograph that's been circulated, and I'll come back to that in a second, but this is the 1966 Portuguese World Cup team, and as you can see, it's racially integrated at a time when Portugal was engaged in 3 simultaneous wars with independence movements in its African colonies. But again, I'll get to that momentarily. So the title of the paper, as you can see, is Athletic Goals, Life Goals, African Soccer Players, Labor Strategies, and Migration within the Portuguese Colonial Empire. And so I'm going to be talking about these African athletes, African soccer players, football players, who came from the colonies, primarily Mozambique and Angola, to the metropole, to Portugal, from roughly the mid-1940s until 75. So it cut it off at the end of the colonial period. So when superstar soccer player Eusébio, which I pointed out is right here, left the field following Portugal's 2-1 defeat to England in the 1966 World Cup semifinals. He was awash in tears, fiercely clutching his red and green jersey, as you can see, the national colors of Portugal. Yet Eusébio was neither born nor grew up in Portugal. He was instead a Mozambican. He was one of many Africans who made their way from Portugal's colonial territories, African colonial territories, although they did have a few go-in players, to the metropole to apply their athletic skills from roughly the mid-40s to the end of the colonial period in 75. Like Eusébio, many of these African players performed spectacularly on the field, significantly elevating the play of their respective club teams, and also vaulting the Portuguese national team to unprecedented levels, most notably the third-place finish at the 1966 World Cup. So all these individuals played for club teams, private sort of individual teams, and then they also played for the Portuguese national team. And so here's the kind of, here's this sort of iconic image of Eusébio leaving the field following the 2-1 loss to England, actually, who went on to win the tournament in '66, and it was actually played in England. So while both Eusébio and Portuguese everywhere, and the far-flung Portuguese diaspora, grieved following the squad's exit from the '66 World Cup. The country was simultaneously engaged in far greater matters, as I indicated. So since the early 1960s, early to mid-1960s, Portugal had been actively attempting to suppress armed insurgencies in 3 of its African colonies, Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea. Unlike other European colonizing nations, Portugal's dictatorial regime intransigently resisted international pressure to decolonize, locking itself in a struggle to retain its Portuguese possessions. And based on the composition of the audience, I'm sure you're familiar with, I think we have a Lusophone audience here, but just in case there's anyone else present, this is Portugal. And these were the Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea where the wars were. This is Sao Tome and Principe, and also the Cape Verde Islands. So Portugal's 5 sort of colonial possessions. In Africa, there wasn't sort of violent unrest in Cape Verde and Sao Tome the way that there was sort of very organized resistance in the other 3 colonies. Portuguese regime's insistence on the territorial and thus racial integration of Portugal and its African colonies was central to this sort of international public relations campaign intended to legitimize and thereby maintain its empire. And I recall that the French Empire, French African Empire, Francophone Empire, and also England's African Empire come to an end basically by this point. As such, the inclusion of African players such as Eusébio on Portugal's national soccer team afforded the regime an opportunity to highlight the unity of the metropole and the colonies, the opportunities for social mobility that its African colonial subjects allegedly enjoyed, and the attendant racial harmony that this integration purportedly fostered. And again, we can return to the image of the '66 World Cup team. And so you see Hilarius from Mozambique, Vicente Lucas is from Mozambique, so is Eusébio, and so is Colonial. So what I'm going to talk about today, or what this paper is going to examine, is one, the experiences of these African players as they relocated to Portugal, their attempts to negotiate this very politically charged environment. Remember, this is during the conflicts for the most part. And 3, their attempts to consolidate their post-soccer futures. Through a reconstruction of this process, I'm going to argue that the labor reforms that enabled these players to seek employment in Portugal were politically motivated, intended primarily to appease external critics of the Portuguese empire, and were in practice highly restrictive, while the regime's effusive self-congratulatory propaganda regarding these players was largely spurious. I also contend that despite the otherwise extraordinary nature of these individuals' lives, their experiences suggest strong continuities with and affinities to popular African labor strategies. So this is my attempt to sort of tie this back into labor history, including seeking occupational advice from more senior employees, in this case players, teammates, and engaging in secondary migration in order to improve their working conditions. And then finally, I'll argue that the multifaceted process of cultural assimilation that helped these players adjust to their new surroundings in Portugal, in fact, commenced often inconspicuously in Africa's urban colonized spaces, and thus well before these players ever set foot in Portugal. So I'm trying to bring this process of cultural assimilation back to Africa as opposed to suggesting that it commences only when they arrive in Portugal. However, their overt and virtually unflinching apoliticism, a corollary of their long-term social improvement objectives, suggests that they also actively and strategically sought to integrate socially, or at least cultivate this perception. Ultimately, these players' experiences illuminate the cosmetic and limited nature of Portugal's labor and social reforms, even when applied to arguably the nation's highest profile wage earners. I mean, these are international superstars. But also some of the ways that Africans could creatively, if carefully, exploit opportunities generated by the shift in the social, occupational, political landscapes in the waning decades of the Portuguese Empire. Okay, so this is late colonial empire. Okay, so how did this all transpire? The government-sanctioned relocation of African soccer players to Portugal during this late colonial period, again we're talking about 45 to 75, suggests that mounting international pressure significantly impacted the regime's regulatory ethos. Okay? As Portugal attempted to mollify both international critics, and there were many of them, and its increasingly discontent colonial subjects, while also endeavoring to retain control of the empire, hastily enacted policies were often sort of schizophrenic in nature, and Portuguese labor policy was no exception. Contradictions within this legislation significantly shaped the experiences of these growing numbers of talented Africans who hope to capitalize on their athletic abilities. So on one hand, these players were able to pursue remunerative opportunities that would have previously been unimaginable due to the institutionalized racism that characterized Portugal's colonial reign in Africa. So beginning in the 1940s, but really more earnestly in the 1950s and 1960s, Portugal waves a host of travel and labor restrictions in order to facilitate the employment and relocation of these players. The shifting attitude towards African labor was manifested, of course, in the initial signing of these players, and then also later the high levels of responsibility that these players assumed for both their club teams and the national team. So many of these players actually were the captains of not only their club teams, but also the national team, sort of before the end of the Portuguese colonial era, sort of a belated acknowledgement that nationality could be defined by culture rather than race. And just have a quick photograph here of one of the very first. Let's see, where is it? I apologize. And he was one of the first, and he came over in the 1940s. And this is a photograph of his team in Maputo, in Lourenço Marques, the Portuguese colonial capital, Desportivo Lourenço Marques. So he's one of the very first individuals to come over, and I had an opportunity to interview him as well. He's in his early 80s now, and mid-80s, I think, by now, but really interesting individual. Anyways, in spite of the fact that these players could sort of proceed to the highest levels of the Portuguese soccer universe, in practice, this universe was quite circumscribed. For example, although metropolitan clubs and the Portuguese government coordinated their efforts to enable the former to sign and then relocate these players were not permitted to seek subsequent employment beyond Portugal's borders. So they were allowed to come to Portugal, but not go anywhere else. Perhaps no case illustrates this better than that of Eusébio, who, as a result of all of his success, including at the '66 World Cup, attracted suitors from across Europe, only to discover that Salazar, the Portuguese dictator, had classified him as a national treasure, literally, which precluded any potential employment abroad. So he was basically stuck. He flirted with a number of clubs, Spanish clubs, mainly Italian clubs, and got pretty close until Salazar said, "No way." And understandably, because he was sort of a symbol of this, or allegedly a symbol of this international, colonial national unity. When other players, sort of maybe less high profile than Eusébio, flirted with foreign clubs, they often find themselves either under surveillance by Portugal's secret police, quickly assigned to military duty, or otherwise constrained. Okay, so in other words, nobody left. You could make it as far as Portugal, but you weren't going anywhere beyond that. So as such, even if the intra-empire upward labor mobility that the Portuguese regime was touting featured a very high, or really arguably no ceiling, its walls, and if we want to continue this metaphor, were rather narrow and in practice strictly delineated. Even the social mobility that Eusébio and other players seemingly embodied is somewhat dubious upon closer examination. So while the regime sort of relentlessly trumpeting these rags to riches narratives in which forlorn Africans rose to the highest levels of Portuguese society via their soccer acumen, players such as Eusébio, who actually is a rags to riches story, were the exception rather than the rule. Instead, in practice, most of these players were members of an extremely small, privileged minority in Portugal's colonies who had benefited from otherwise rare educational opportunities and were oftentimes the offspring of Portuguese fathers and African mothers, so mestiços, and therefore enjoyed a special sort of intermediate legal and social status. As Hilario's one of the individuals I pointed out, and during our interview, originally from Mozambique, he indicated to me, quote, "There were many players who lived quite well in Lourenço Marques, the colonial capital of Mozambique, and only came to Portugal because they wanted to play for a club that mattered and for the recognition." So as such, I'm understanding that many of these African players' migration to Portugal should be more accurately constituted a form of geographical rather than social mobility, as they were moving from sort of one advantaged environment to another. That may be a reductive or too simplistic analysis of that process, but sticking with that for now. Okay, so I want to move on to this notion of cultural assimilation. So the commencement in Africa of the process of cultural assimilation for players also contributed to their often seamless transition from Africa to Portugal. because virtually all the African clubs with which these players were affiliated prior to being discovered featured Portuguese coaches, Portuguese scouts, etc. And were also all invariably located in urban areas, the loci of European colonization. Every one of these future migrants, regardless of their social backgrounds, spent time in these colonized spaces and were thus exposed to Portuguese customs, values, etc. prior to leaving the continent. This familiarity with Portuguese culture in turn helps these players transition upon reaching the metropole and ultimately to assimilate reasonably effortlessly. So I have a photograph of Eusébio actually here. So this is Eusébio's club before he came to the metropole. I'm just hoping I have a picture of a Portuguese coach. I apologize. This is when he played for Sporting and ultimately ended up on Benfica, which is a story in and of itself. The metropolitan clubs that facilitated these players' migration to Portugal also played a role in this typically smooth transition by reducing opportunities for conflict, confrontation, and culturally based confusion. How? Well, upon reaching Portugal, the club officials typically whisked the players away to team homes or team houses. So they would often arrive via boat. Only later on were they flown to Portugal. So they'd arrive at the dock, they'd have sort of a mini press conference, and then they were immediately taken away to these official sort of clubhouses. So Eusébio explained to me during our interview that quote, when I arrived in Portugal in 1960, Benfica already had a house called the Benfica House, Casa de Benfica. Not very creative, but anyways. If you played for Benfica and you were single, you went there. When I arrived, I went straight to the Benfica house, and I had my... Eusébio's story is slightly unique because they actually had to hide him for a while because he should have been going to Sporting, which is one of Benfica's big rivals. But anyways, that's a whole, like I said, a whole sub-story, but that's not necessarily the important point here. I had my own room there, and there was always someone who took care of the domestic work. We had television and other games, and it felt like our home. If we had a game on Sunday, we would all stay in the house. Married players, too, starting on Friday, so they'd all be concentrated together. So we would all be together. The close contact with all of your teammates created a sense of union. Everyone knew each other, talked to each other every day, went to practice together every day, went to the movies together, had dinner together, and then watched some television. You'll notice the word together. At 11 p.m., someone would turn off the lights, and we would all go to bed. So a very regimented form of existence upon arrival. Situation for Hilario and other players from Mozambique who played for Sporting Lisboa was much the same, although his club didn't initially have a facility similar to the one that Benfica had. During his interview, he indicated to me that, quote, I left Mozambique in 1958, so actually prior to Eusébio, with a contract to play for Sporting, and when I arrived in Portugal, there were vacant rooms for us in the homes of old ladies, who I presumed were widows, for any unmarried players. So Sporting would pay for us to stay in those rooms, and those old ladies would also cook and clean for us. Later, Sporting built a sports center, and then all the single players would stay there and eat there, while the married players would come on Thursdays to sleep during this time of concentration before the game. And I don't mean concentration like mental concentration, but just gathering everyone together so that, to sort of reinforce this notion of team unity leading up to the games. End quote. Although players predictably missed their relatives and other facets of their now distant homelands, the combination of, one, their decidedly un-African living arrangements, two, the paucity of any Africans residing in Portugal during this period. They were among the very small minority of Africans in metropolitan Portugal. Three, the fact that the vast majority of their teammates were Portuguese, of course. And four, I mean, this is prior to the years now where you have teams comprised of players from all over the world. And I'm an Arsenal fan, for example, and they may only have one or two. A London-based team, they may only have a couple English players on the team in a squad of 25. And four, their undeniable appreciation of the material benefits that this new milieu offered them, and by extension, of course, their families, often engendered a genuine adoption of this new environment. And I do think this is genuine in my interviews with these individuals. In fact, many players married Portuguese women, and decades after their playing days concluded, continued to reside in Portugal, most famously Eusébio, who is the face of Portuguese soccer. So again, just a couple photographs. You can see this is the 1950s, so you're starting to see more individuals, more athletes coming from the colonies and integrating into the teams. And these are the starting 11, so these guys are not necessarily just on the team, sort of sitting on the bench. So here, I mean, just looking quickly, you can see at least 3 players who came from the African colonies. And this is Porto, one of Portugal's best clubs in the 50s. And I don't need to tell you that this is from the 70s. Due to the rather nifty cap the goalkeeper's wearing. But in any event, so this is 1973. Again, you can see some of the players who came from the African colonies. If players largely adapted or assimilated culturally and integrated socially with very few difficulties, they also adopted a series of familiar labor strategies to help with occupational adjustments and ultimately to capitalize to the full extent possible, of course, on these new remunerative opportunities. In some ways, the superstar status of many of these players worked to obscure their reliance on labor strategies that Africans in Portugal's colonies had been employing for decades, if not longer. For example, prior to leaving Africa, many of these soccer prospects sought occupational advice from players who had already migrated to Portugal, typically inquiring about what wages they should ask for or seek and which clubs offered the best working and, in this case, really living conditions. Once established in the metropole, they also sought advice from more experienced players when it came time to renegotiate their contracts. Eusébio indicated to me that he even relied on more senior players for advice regarding how to conduct himself when interacting with Salazar, the dictator, who had prevented him from playing elsewhere in Europe. So he told me a funny story that he would be called into Salazar's office periodically, and he would take Colonial with him, who was one of the older players from Mozambique, and they would Colonial would indicate to Salazar that Eusébio's Portuguese wasn't very good, and so that he would do the talking, and so that Eusébio didn't say anything out of line, and so kind of a funny story. So he served as kind of an advisor or a counselor to him. These players also engaged in well-worn labor migration strategies, retracing the footsteps of migrant laborers, in this case soccer players, who had preceded them in order, again, to secure the best wages and conditions, working conditions possible. Reminiscent of Mozambicans seeking employment on mines in South Africa, for example. Many players also engaged in secondary migration, subsequently affiliating with a series of different clubs in Portugal, just as mine workers might deliberately switch employers in an attempt to improve their own working conditions. Perhaps a stretch, but stay with me here. Thus, even as these players navigated this drastically different terrain, they fell back on familiar labor tactics, labor strategies. Indigenous laborers throughout Portugal's African empire would find neither their fundamental occupational nor migratory strategies unfamiliar. So just quickly, here's a couple photographs. So this is Eusébio on the left, and this is Colonial on the right. I think this is the year they won the Portuguese Cup. I can't remember what year that is. Again, Eusébio on the left, Colonial on the right. I think that's Awash, who was white and golden or white Mozambican. He was a goalkeeper. And then also Hilario, who though was not on Benfica, didn't play for the same club team as Eusébio, again acted as sort of an advisor, sort of someone who had been in Portugal longer, helped them sort of negotiate this sort of new environment. And they both still live in Lisbon. Okay, so in practice, the migration paths, okay, so the sort of new topic here. In practice, the migration paths that players traverse did not always simply culminate with their arrival at a new soccer club. Many of these players parlayed their ability to relocate to Portugal to also commence or to continue their studies, their academic studies, or to secure long-term employment in the country, both of which were intended to sort of safeguard their futures beyond the end of their inevitable playing days. Or inevitable end of their playing days, I should say. The former endeavor was accomplished by playing for Académica de Coimbra, the club that's linked with Portugal's premier university, or what was Portugal's premier university, whose squad during the colonial era was comprised solely of matriculating students, and that was actually the case beyond the end of the colonial period, but is not anymore. So Coimbra was linked with the university, kind of the way in America you'd have a university sport. I know you have university sports teams in Canada too, but it's not as insane as it is in America. Ridiculous. So this is a club that, as I said, was comprised solely of matriculating students, and this was a target for many of these athletes. So Coimbra doesn't recruit in Africa because this was expensive. They left this endeavor to the major Portuguese clubs, Benfica, Sporting, Porto, and Belenenses, who has fallen on hard times, but is in a suburb of sort of part of Lisbon, the greater Lisbon area. And now I think all of 42 people go to their games. But it's a beautiful place to see a game, I can tell you that, looking right out over the Tejo. The university team subsequently became a target for many African soccer players after they arrived. So in order to reach Coimbra, players requested transfers or loans, and this is very common practice in soccer, to Academica in the hopes of earning a degree that would in turn serve them well long after their athleticism faded. For example, Augusto Araújo, who first arrived in Portugal in 1956 from Angola actually to play for Benfica, eventually made his way to Academica, and he's just one example of many. In a 1960 interview, he indicated that, quote, Benfica is a great club, and I am its player, but I have determined that Academica offers me more possibilities. My ambition has always been to become an engineer. I came to Lisbon with this intention, ready to fight for it, and I haven't relented. I know that through this achievement, I will give my parents and my brother great happiness. Happily. For Araújo and apparently his family too, this was a goal that he was ultimately able to achieve. So here's a photograph of, here's Mario Wilson. He's the individual I told you he's in his 80s now. This is Augusto Araújo, the individual I was just talking about. This is on the streets of Coimbra, 1958. And this is Daniel Chipenda. Some of you who work on Angola might recognize that name. He's actually one of the individuals who returned to Angola to fight the Portuguese. So played soccer for a while at Academica, integrated reasonably well in talking to his teammates, etc. But decided to return to Angola, fight for the MPLA, eventually switched or had a falling out with the MPLA, joined the FNLA briefly, and then back to the MPLA, and then died in combat in the mid-90s maybe. Actually, I think I have a couple of these photographs. Okay, so here's the 1961 starting 11 for Academica, and there's Araújo, this is Mario Torres, Mario Wilson, and then Chipenda's right here. So you can see 4 out of 11 coming from the colonies, studying at Academica while they're there. There's a great archive at the municipal library. The photographer who captured, who took all these pictures in the 50s and 60s and early 70s of these African players, among other things, that the library's preserved. Absolutely fabulous. Oops. Okay, so clubs such as Benfica, who lost players to Coimbra in this manner, understandably disdain this practice because they lost some actually reasonably good players to Academica, which would not happen today. The Portuguese regime deemed the enrollment of Africans at its best university as valuable propaganda material, and thus sanctioned these players' strategic requests. So meanwhile, other African players are seeking long-term security at CUF, which is the Companhia União Fabril, which is an industrial conglomerate located near Lisbon. CUF, and also fielded a first division team. CUF required the players on its team that it sponsored to be company employees and also guaranteed them jobs following their playing days. In fact, many players had similar experiences, that is, both working and playing for the same entity while still in Africa. For example, Hilario explained to me that, quote, I worked for a little bit in Lourenço Marques. When I played for Atlético Sport de Lourenço Marques, the team gave me a job as a plumber. In Mozambique, you couldn't make any money playing soccer, so if another club wanted me, they would have had to offer me a better job outside of soccer. And so here's the railroad team. So this was yet another example of this. In Colonial, Mozambique, the railroad sponsored a team, and therefore, if you were on that team, you had to have a job working with a railroad. And so oftentimes, that's kind of how it went. You were good at soccer, and then you got a job. You can understand how and why. It didn't often happen the other way around, that you happened to be working on the railroad and somehow somebody discovered that you were good at soccer. So they were kind of drafting players in and offering them jobs. So the Africans had some experience with this notion that soccer facilitates employment. So although neither Coimbra, the university team, nor CUF were particularly competitive on the field, the secondary migration strategies that these players employed in order to secure academic and employment opportunities in many cases represented foresighted thinking that sacrificed potential short-term glory in exchange for long-term security. So CUF and Coimbra weren't overly good. I mean, they had their moments, but that's not where you went if you wanted to win championships and cups, etc. Just as these players strategically exploited the range of educational and remunerative opportunities in Portugal, they also deftly navigated the politically charged environments in both the metropole and the colonies that the wars for independence were fueling. So this was a challenge they had when they arrived, of course. And these athletes were viewed neither, in general, as subversives by the Portuguese population, nor as political stooges or collaborators by their African brothers who were fighting and dying for independence, even though many of the players donned Portuguese national team jerseys and military uniforms. They were often drafted, and all of them were drafted into the Portuguese army. Players like Eusébio were given sort of cush positions where they would have to go to the military base in the morning, do calisthenics and things like that. And then there was actually a military team, which was very good, as you might imagine, because Eusébio and these players played on it. But were never sent to the colonies to actually fight. Their participation was more symbolic. Although often internally conflicted, these athletes' professionalism and determination to improve their lives, and again the lives of their families, underpin their conspicuous apoliticism throughout this period. As Eusébio once famously declared, quote, "I am a professional who seeks nothing more than to work. Soccer is my politics," end quote. As such, despite these players' allure as potential nationalist symbols for both the Portuguese regime and the various African independence movements, they failed to serve either the insurgencies or the counterinsurgency well, all the while remaining widely respected and admired in both the metropole and the colonies. So walking sort of a very fine line in that sense. So for example, here's a couple photographs of, here's Eusébio returning in 1966 from England to Portugal, getting a hero's welcome. And it's not just him. As you can see, it's the entire team. And this is in downtown Lisbon as they return home. Even though they didn't win, they finished in third, which for Portugal was fantastic, and would be today for that matter too. Okay, so to conclude, by shifting the focus away from exploitative colonial or neo-colonial, from the exploitative colonial or neo-colonial state or predatory soccer clubs, which are recurrent themes in African soccer scholarship, to the players themselves, my research aims to dispel notions of these athletes as victims and instead considers them as individuals strategically offering their labor to those employers that provided the best possible conditions in which to earn a living. As Eusébio's mother candidly proclaimed after being asked why her son chose Benfica over the other clubs, quote, "Benfica gave big money." So thus studies that sound the alarm regarding the exodus of African footballers risk ignoring these migrants' aspirations to improve their lives, and by extension those of family members, just as millions of Africans did throughout the colonial era and continue to do so today. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd.